News just in now, a group of European Union leaders gathered in Brussels on Sunday to discuss a common approach to asylum and migration. Now, the EU is holding this migration mini-summit after the scandals over boat-carrying African migrants. For more on this, I'm very pleased to be joined all the way from Brussels by our correspondent there, Jack PARROCK. Jack, a very good afternoon to you. Tell us all about this gathering. And I mean, is why the need for such a gathering? We've seen the growing scourge of migrants, and of course the latest shock being those utterances by Donald Trump about the children being detained because of their parents or even with their parents.
Exactly. So while the United States has their sort of migration and detention issue going on, the Europeans have got it right on their plate as well. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel actually called this meeting for fear over her government falling apart over migration. It was originally meant to be a mini summit of 6 countries of the EU's 28 countries, but in the end it's ended up as 16 of them, because it is such a wide-ranging issue and is so pressing here for so many different countries. You have countries like Greece and Italy that have holding a lot of refugees and migrants who've reached their shores from mainly rescue ships. They've been saved from smugglers' boats in the Mediterranean Sea after they've left on those smugglers' boats from the Libyan coastline. Many of them picked up by rescue ships operated by European either NGOs or some by the Italian Coast Guard, for instance, and taken to either Italian, Maltese, sometimes Greek shores as well. And there's been huge numbers of people, so that's why the European Union is having to face this. We saw a new Italian government be elected in on the promise that they would deport 500,000 refugees from Italy.
Absolutely. You know, Jack, maybe give us a background context. What seems to be the main challenge with these countries actually dealing with curbing the scourge of migration? What is really the problem there?
Well, what you've got is countries like Italy and Greece with many, many refugees and migrants there waiting to maybe find their way into other European countries. You've got countries like Germany, which have accepted high numbers, over about 1 million refugees they accepted in 2015 when the initial part of this refugee crisis first started. And then you have other countries in the European Union like Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, these countries to the east that are refusing to take any, even though the European Union put up a sort of relocation system which was aimed to try and share the burden of where these asylum seekers could live. And essentially in the European Union this all comes down to a very important piece of regulation called the Dublin Regulation. And what that is essentially that where a person first arrives, where they're first registered in the European Union, is the place that they're allowed to apply for asylum. So those countries like Italy and Greece, which have seen high numbers of people, they're the ones having to deal with all the registrations and all the asylum claims of those people. Some in other countries like Hungary, etc., when the crisis first happened, but predominantly in those countries. And because of that, what you've now seen is 2 boats over the last couple of weeks be stranded in the Mediterranean waters. There's one still there with about 230 African people on it, because Italy and Malta don't want to take them, because as soon as they arrive it will be them that has to deal with the asylum processing. And that's what the European Union leaders are here today. They're now looking potentially at setting up perhaps processing centres in North African countries as a way of dealing with this, but the North African countries don't want that. They see it as a way that it will just push the problem onto the other side of the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah. And Jack, I mean, were there any notion that they're actually going to encourage those migrators that they should be going back to their countries? I mean, let's talk about the outcomes and or resolutions that will be taken here. How will they then be implemented?
It's really difficult to know what they're going to do today. I don't think we'll have any real concrete plans come out of this summit. This is really Angela Merkel trying to save face and show that she's doing something, because the German Chancellor has a lot of questions on her. She's in a coalition government with a Bavarian group of Christian Democrats, essentially, in Bavaria, and they're saying that they will shut the southern border of her own country if she doesn't do something about that. So that's why she's done this. But next Thursday, we have a summit of 28, all the 28 EU leaders. And what they're going to be looking at is a couple of things. Firstly, this idea of the North African centres and how they would implement that. Well, that's a long way off yet. It's whether they can even get any agreement on doing that, because there's very controversial from a human rights perspective, especially among NGOs, to potentially, if it were in Libya, which is obviously a very fractious country at the moment, to have asylum processing centres there. And the second thing is to overhaul this regulation, this Dublin regulation within the European Union, which says that asylum must only be processed by the first country that a person is registered in. What they're looking at is trying to expand that, so perhaps there could be more burden sharing. But there's a lot of divisions among European countries at the moment. While that's a way of doing it, there's countries in the East that simply will not accept any asylum requests.
Absolutely, Jack, because I mean compliance would be very difficult with these things, looking at the different countries with their own sovereign rules.
Yeah, exactly, and this is exactly it. The interesting thing to note here as well, though, is that while we're talking about sort of crisis mode for the European Union, only 41,000 people have actually come across the Mediterranean, we think, so far, according to UN figures anyway, which is significantly less than the million or so people that came over in 2015. The problem here isn't necessarily such a crisis in the Mediterranean of the numbers, it's the political crisis in the European Union and the politicians being unable to unify on this issue.
All right, and Jack, just before I let you go, let's look at what the ramifications of this would be should this issue be left alone and not be resolved.
The main significant and the main concern is that it could pull down Angela Merkel's German coalition government, and what that would mean would be fresh insecurity on this issue firstly, and who would maybe get in, because the Alternative for Deutschland, a far-right party in Germany, did quite well in recent elections, but also what that would mean not only on the migration issue but also on other issues in the European Union. So with Brexit going on, the sort of weakened German government or a new German government that might have other ideas about it, how they would fit in with this sort of powerful and progressive French president in Emmanuel Macron, who's doing lots of overhauls and reforms in his country, but he has the support of Angela Merkel, so it could really pull apart the European Union.
Jack, I wish we had more time. We would have discussed the African leaders' side of things, but unfortunately we have to leave it there for now. That is our correspondent all the way out in Brussels, Mr. Jack PARROCK, and is talking to us about the migration summit that is taking place out in Brussels. That is, of course, organized by the EU leaders. Let's now take a quick ad break.